Why did Baltic traditions survive every empire that tried to erase them? The Crusaders came. The Teutonic Order followed. The Russian Empire expanded. The Nazis occupied the region. The Soviet Union tried to reshape it. And these were only some of them. Borders changed, empires rose, empires fell. Yet somehow, something survived. This shouldn't have happened. Most of Europe's ancient pagan traditions disappeared centuries ago. By all expectations, the Baltics should have followed, but they didn't. So what made them different? Why did some of the last pagan traditions of Europe survive here, when so many others vanished? To answer that, we need to go back to a time before empires, before borders, before nations, to the people who lived on the eastern shores of the Baltic Sea, the people we now call the Balts.
Most ancient cultures disappeared. So why was the Baltic world different? To answer that, we need to understand the world that existed before the empires arrived, before the Crusaders, before the Teutonic Order, before the Russian Empire, before the borders and countries we know today. There was another Baltic world, a world of dense forests stretching beyond the horizon, of rivers that connected distant communities long before roads crossed the land, of seasonal fires glowing against the darkness of the northern sky, of people whose lives moved with the rhythms of nature rather than the calendars of kings. The people who lived here did not think of themselves as Latvians, Lithuanians, or Estonians. Those identities belonged to a much later age. Instead, the region was home to many tribes and peoples. Ancestors of today's Latvians and Lithuanians spoke Baltic languages. To the north lived Finnic peoples, the ancestors of modern Estonians. They spoke different languages. They traced different origins. Yet they shared the same forests, the same coastlines, and many of the same challenges. Over the centuries, they would also face many of the same empires. Life here was organized around cycles. The return of the sun after the long winter.
The planting of crops, the harvest, the changing of seasons. Nature was not simply part of life, it was the framework through which life itself was understood. Knowledge was rarely stored in books, it lived in memory, in stories, in songs, in symbols, in rituals, repeated so many times that they became inseparable from everyday life. By the time much of Europe was building cathedrals, founding kingdoms, and consolidating centralized power, large parts of the Baltic region still preserved older traditions that had already disappeared elsewhere. This was not because the Baltics were isolated. Trade routes crossed the region. Merchants arrived from distant lands. Ideas traveled. The outside world was never far away. Yet something here proved remarkably resilient. While ancient belief systems across Europe faded, merged, or vanished, the Baltic region remained one of the last places where pre-Christian traditions continued to shape daily life. But that world would not remain untouched. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a new force arrived from the west. Not as traders, not as travelers, but with a mission: to conquer, to convert, and to transform one of the last surviving frontiers of Europe's older world. The centuries that followed would become the ultimate stress test of Baltic memory.
Nearly 8 centuries. For almost 800 years, the peoples of the Baltic region lived under one foreign power after another. Few cultures face that kind of pressure. Fewer still survive it. Yet this story is not about a single conquest. It is about what happens when conquest becomes normal. when your grandparents, your parents, and your children all grow up under different rulers. When one empire leaves and another arrives. The language of power changed. The uniforms changed. The flags changed. But for the people living here, uncertainty remained. The Crusaders came. The Teutonic Order followed. Danish kings ruled parts of the region. Swedish kings expanded their influence. German elites dominated local institutions for centuries. The Russian Empire absorbed much of the Baltic region into a state stretching across continents. Then came Nazi Germany, then the Soviet Union. And these are only the most recognizable names. The names changed. The pressure remained. Each new power arrived with its own vision of how the region should look, how people should worship, how they should govern themselves, how they should speak, how they should think.
Some changes happened gradually. Others arrived with armies. Ancient sacred sites disappeared. Traditional ways of life were transformed. Foreign institutions replaced older structures. New identities were encouraged. Old identities were pushed aside. Generations grew up under rulers they had never chosen. For centuries, adaptation became a necessity of survival. The Baltic world learned to bend. But bending is not the same as breaking. Wars, occupations, deportations, political repression. Entire communities uprooted. Entire generations forced to adapt to yet another reality. By the 20th century, the old Baltic world should have been gone. History suggested it would not survive. Too many empires, too many wars, too many centuries. Yet somehow, it did. And that raises an even bigger question. How do you preserve a culture when almost everything around it keeps changing?
Empires can occupy land, but how do you occupy memory? How do you erase a culture that has no single capital, no single temple, no single library, no single place where its knowledge is stored? That may have been the secret. Many ancient civilizations concentrated their knowledge in monuments, institutions, and centers of power. When those centers fell, much of what they preserved fell with them. The Baltic world was different. Without realizing it, it possessed something many civilizations lacked. Its most important archive was decentralized. It lived inside people. Imagine a grandmother teaching an old song to her grandchildren. Not because she believes she is preserving history, not because she sees herself as protecting a civilization, but simply because that is how it has always been done. A story repeated around a family table, a symbol passed from parent to child, a midsummer fire lit on the shortest night of the year.
Small acts, ordinary acts, almost invisible acts, yet repeated across thousands of villages and hundreds of years, they became remarkably difficult to erase. A sacred grove could be cut down, a shrine could be destroyed, a ruler could ban a tradition. But it is far harder to destroy something carried in the minds of thousands. Much of Baltic culture survived not by resisting change, but by adapting to it. Older beliefs blended with newer traditions. Ancient symbols found new meanings. Customs evolved. Some practices disappeared. Others went quiet. Yet fragments remained, hidden in plain sight. So ordinary that few people noticed they were preserving anything at all. Not in castles, not in governments, not in institutions,
but in people. And when the great pressures of history finally began to ease, those fragments were still there, waiting to be remembered.
How much was lost? We may never know. Sacred sites vanished. Ancient customs changed. Entire ways of life disappeared into history. The Baltic world that existed before the Crusaders is gone. History never leaves anything untouched. Yet that is not the whole story, because survival does not always mean preserving everything. Sometimes survival means preserving enough memory, enough stories, enough symbols, enough songs, enough fragments for the next generation to remember where they came from. That may be why Baltic traditions endured when so many others disappeared. Not because they were protected by walls, not because they were preserved by rulers, but because they became part of everyday life. A song, a fire, a symbol, a story. Repeated so many times that they became larger than any empire that tried to replace them. And perhaps that is the real lesson hidden within the Baltic story. Empires rise, empires fall, borders move, flags change. But the things people carry within themselves can outlast them all. Nearly 8 centuries of pressure could not fully erase the memory, because the code was never stored in stone. It was stored in people. And in many ways, it still is.